She asked the question like it cost her something to say it. Not flirtatious. Not playful. Quiet. The way people speak when they've already decided to be embarrassed about something before they've finished saying it. Can you pretend to be my boyfriend? Just for tonight. Daniel Reyes did not answer right away. He had learned, over 11 years of friendship with Mara Quinn, that some questions needed silence before they could be properly heard. So he gave her the silence. He gave her 3 full seconds of it, standing in the hallway outside her apartment with a grocery bag of wine she'd asked him to bring, and absolutely no idea this was waiting for him on the other side of her door. What she didn't know, what he had never once let her know, not in 11 years, not on the worst nights or the best ones, was that he had been hoping she would ask him something like this since he was 23 years old. He just hadn't expected it to come wrapped in panic instead of feeling. Why, he said finally. Not a refusal. A question that was buying him time to look like a person who hadn't just felt his entire chest rearrange itself. Because my family is inside that apartment, Mara said, and her voice cracked on the word family in a way that told him this was bigger than an apartment. And I told my mother 3 months ago that I was seeing someone. I made him up, Daniel. I made up a whole person. I gave him a name. I gave him a job. I told her he travels for work, which is why she's never met him, and she has spent 3 months asking when she gets to meet him, and tonight, somehow, she is here. She is inside my apartment right now, with my aunt and my sister, who all believe I have a boyfriend named Ethan, who does not exist. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Ethan, he repeated. Don't, she said. You named your fake boyfriend Ethan. I panicked. Ethan was the first name that came out of my mouth, and I have hated it ever since. And that is not the point. The point is my mother is inside that apartment, and you are the only person I trust enough to ask this of, and I need you to say yes before I lose my nerve completely. He should have asked more questions. A reasonable person would have asked more questions. Instead, Daniel Reyes set the wine down on the hallway table, looked at the door behind which an entire fabricated relationship was about to be tested in front of people who loved her, and said the only thing he had wanted to say to her for 11 years, dressed now as something far smaller than it actually was. Okay. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since she texted him 40 minutes earlier. Thank you. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. He had every idea what it meant. That was precisely the problem. What she did not know, standing in that hallway with relief flooding her face, was that Daniel had spent the better part of a decade perfecting the specific art of being exactly present enough to stay close to her and exactly distant enough to never risk losing her. He had watched her date other men. He had sat across from her at dinners where she described their flaws in such precise, frustrated detail that he sometimes wondered if she was testing whether he'd ever point out that he didn't share any of them. He never did. He had decided, somewhere around year 3, that being her closest friend was a position he was not willing to gamble for the chance of being something more, because the math was simple and brutal. If he told her and she didn't feel it back, he wouldn't lose a relationship. He would lose her completely. So he had stayed quiet. For 8 years he had stayed quiet. And now she was handing him a single night in which he was allowed, required, even to hold her hand in front of people who mattered to her, to call her something tender in a room full of witnesses, to be, for a few hours, exactly what he had always wanted to be without ever having to risk asking for it. He understood, even as he reached for the doorknob, that this was either the safest version of getting what he wanted or the most dangerous one. He did not yet know which. One rule, he said, hand still on the door. Anything. If your mother asks how we met, we say the truth. We met in college. That part doesn't need to be invented. Mara's expression flickered, something he couldn't quite read, gone before he could examine it. Okay, she said. The truth. About how we met. It would turn out, 3 hours later, to be the only true thing either of them said all night. Everything else would blur the lines so completely that neither of them would be entirely sure, by the end of the evening, where the performance had ended and something else had quietly begun standing in its place. He opened the door. The apartment smelled like the lavender candle Mara always lit when she was nervous and wanted her space to smell like a person who had her life together. Daniel noticed it immediately, the way he noticed most things about her without trying to. A side effect, he sometimes thought, of 11 years spent paying closer attention to Mara Quinn than to almost anything else in his life. Her mother rose first. Elena Quinn was a small woman with an enormous presence, the kind of mother who could make a room feel evaluated within 4 seconds of entering it. Her eyes moved from Mara to Daniel and narrowed, very slightly, with the particular suspicion of a woman who had been told a story for 3 months and was now checking it against the evidence in front of her. "You must be Ethan," Elena said. There was the smallest pause. Daniel felt Mara's hand find his. Not romantic, not yet, just desperate, fingers closing around as like a person grabbing a railing on a staircase that had suddenly gotten steeper. He laced his fingers through hers anyway, because that was what a boyfriend would do, and because some shameless, long-starved part of him had been waiting 11 years for an excuse. "That's me," he said, and the lie came out of him easier than it should have. "Sorry we're a little late. Traffic." Mara's sister, Priya, was watching from the couch with the specific delight of someone who had been promised drama and was now receiving it early. Her aunt, Rosa, was already reaching for her phone, presumably to photograph evidence of Ethan's long-rumored existence for relatives who weren't present. Sit, Elena said, gesturing at the couch with the authority of someone hosting in a home that was not hers. "Tell me everything." "Mara has told me nothing. 3 months of a boyfriend, and I know only that his name is Ethan and that he travels." Daniel sat. Mara sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed into his, and he understood that this proximity was strategic and not personal, and he told himself that fact clearly, the way you tell yourself something true precisely because some part of you doesn't want to believe it. "I travel for work," he said. "Consulting. I'm gone more than I'd like to be." This was, accidentally, true of Daniel's actual job, which made the life feel less like a lie and more like a costume made of his own clothes. "And what does Mara tell you about us?" Elena asked, leaning forward. Daniel glanced at Mara. Mara's eyes carried a flicker of pure panic, the look of someone who had built a house of cards and was now watching her mother lean directly into it. "She tells me you make the best posel in 3 states, Daniel said, "and that I'm not allowed to have an opinion about that until I've actually tasted it, which feels like a setup designed entirely in your favor." Elena laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and something in the room loosened. Mara exhaled beside him, so quietly that only someone sitting exactly where he was sitting could have heard it. "He's funny," Elena said to Mara, like Daniel wasn't sitting directly beside her. "You didn't tell me he was funny." "I told you he was many things," Mara said, recovering. "I was saving some surprises." It went on like that for the better part of an hour. Questions Daniel hadn't prepared for, answered with a fluency that frightened him slightly, because he realized somewhere around question 6 that he wasn't inventing anything. He was simply describing, in the language of a boyfriend, things he already knew to be true about Mara Quinn. Her stress habit of reorganizing her bookshelf at midnight. The way she always ordered dessert and then ate exactly 3 bites before declaring herself finished, every single time, without fail. The fact that she cried at dog food commercials and would deny it under oath. "You know her so well," Rosa said at one point, not as a question. A small, quiet observation that landed somewhere Daniel hadn't expected, somewhere underneath the performance, in the place where the performance and the truth were no longer cleanly separable. "I've known her a long time," Daniel said, and meant it more than anyone in that room understood. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Priya, 3 glasses of wine into the evening and significantly less invested in subtlety than the rest of her family, leaned across the coffee table with the specific gleam of a younger sister who smells a story. "Okay, but how did you two actually get together?" she said. "Because Mara's version changes every time she tells it, which is, frankly, suspicious." Daniel felt Mara go still beside him. This was the question he had warned her about. The one true thing they'd agreed on in the hallway. He opened his mouth to answer it honestly. The real story. The one that didn't require any invention at all. And Mara's hand tightened around his under the table, hard enough that he understood, instantly, that something had changed in the last hour. That the real story, the true one, was somehow now the most dangerous thing either of them could say out loud. He looked at her. She looked back at him with something he hadn't seen on her face in 11 years, something that looked almost like fear, almost like hope, almost like a question she wasn't ready to ask yet. "Go on," Elena said, refilling her own glass, entirely unaware that she had just asked the single most complicated question of the entire evening. "Tell us how it really started." And Daniel Reyes, who had spent 8 years being careful, who had built an entire friendship around never once saying the truest thing he knew, opened his mouth to answer a question that no longer had a safe answer in either direction. The real story started on a Tuesday in October, 11 years ago, in University Library that smelled like old paper and the specific desperation of finals week. Daniel had not been looking for anyone. He had been looking for a missing copy of a chemistry textbook that the library system insisted existed and that several increasingly irritated librarians had been unable to locate for him across 45 minutes of searching. Mara had been the one who found it. Not because she worked there, she didn't, but because she had wandered past 3 times during his search, watched him grow steadily more frustrated, and finally walked over and said, without introduction, "It's miscatalogued. It's under chembio, not chemistry." Whoever shelved it was either drunk or actively spiteful. She had been right. She usually was, a fact Daniel had learned to appreciate rather than resent over the following decade. They had not become friends immediately. That had taken months, built slowly across overlapping classes and a shared dislike of the same professor and, eventually, late-night study sessions that ran long past the point where either of them was actually studying. Daniel remembered with painful clarity the exact night he understood his feelings for her had become something larger than friendship, a Thursday in March, sophomore year, when Mara had shown up at his dorm at 1 a.m. after a breakup, mascara smudged, demanding ice cream and refusing to explain why she was crying until she'd eaten most of a pint of it. He had sat with her for 3 hours that night and said almost nothing, and somewhere in that silence, in the particular intimacy of being the person someone chooses to fall apart in front of, something in him had reorganized itself permanently around her. He had never told her. Not that night, not in any of the nights that followed it. He had watched her date a string of men across the years who were, by his careful and entirely biased estimation, not worthy of the specific effort it took to love Mara Quinn properly, a phrase he had never said aloud to anyone, not even himself, not directly, because saying it directly would have required admitting what it implied. This was the true story. The one he could not tell her mother, not because it was untrue, but because telling it honestly out loud, in front of witnesses, would require revealing the part where he had loved her for 8 of the 11 years he'd known her and had never once said so. "We met in the library," Daniel said finally, choosing the version of true that didn't require detonating anything. "Sophomore year. She found a book the staff couldn't find. I was unreasonably impressed." "That's not an answer to how you got together," Priya said, undeterred. "That's how you met. There's a difference." "Priya," Mara said, a warning. "I'm just saying. 11 years of knowing each other, and you've been together for what? For months? Something happened in between those two things, and I want to know what." Daniel felt the room narrow slightly. He understood, watching Mara's face, that she had not anticipated this particular line of questioning, that the fake relationship had been built to survive surface scrutiny and was not designed to withstand a sister with 3 glasses of wine and an investigative streak. "What happened," Mara said slowly, "is that I almost lost him to someone else and realized I couldn't actually stand the idea of that." The table went quiet. Daniel turned to look at her, and for a moment the performance fell away so completely that he wasn't sure either of them was acting anymore. "There was someone," Mara continued, not looking at Daniel now, looking instead at some fixed point on the coffee table, the way people look at things when they're saying something true and don't trust their face to stay composed if they look at the person it's about. A few months ago, someone he was seeing. And I realized, watching him get ready for a date with her, that I had spent years being fine with being his closest friend, and I was not actually fine with it at all. I had just gotten very good at pretending. This had happened. Daniel had, in fact, dated someone briefly 4 months earlier. A woman named Claire, kind and unremarkable. Someone he had tried to make himself feel something for because Mara wasn't an option he believed existed, and the relationship had lasted 6 weeks before fading the way relationships fade, when one half of the couple is quietly comparing every conversation to a person who isn't in the room. Mara had known about Claire. Mara had even, he remembered now with a strange lurch, seemed unusually invested in asking about her, more invested than the situation seemed to warrant at the time. He had not understood why until this exact moment. I didn't know that, he said quietly, and it was the truest sentence he'd spoken all night, and it was not part of any script either of them had agreed to. Mara finally looked at him. I know you didn't, she said. I wasn't exactly subtle about being unsubtle about it. Elena was watching the two of them now with the specific stillness of a mother who senses she has wandered into something more real than the story she had been told to expect. Priya had gone uncharacteristically quiet. Rosa had lowered her phone entirely. So that's the real story, Mara said, and her voice had gone thin in a way Daniel had heard only a handful of times across 11 years. The voice she used right before crying. The one she usually disguised by leaving the room. I almost lost him without ever telling him I wanted to keep him. And then I got lucky, because somehow, against every reasonable expectation, he still wanted to be found. The room held its breath in a way rooms do when something true has accidentally arrived in the middle of something that was supposed to be fiction. Daniel understood, sitting there with her hand still laced through his, that the version of the story she had just told was not, technically, the story of Ethan, the fictional boyfriend who traveled for consulting work and didn't exist. It was the story of Daniel, reorganized slightly, compressed in its timeline, but unmistakably, unbearably true in its emotional shape. She had just told her family the truth, disguised as the lie they had agreed to tell. He didn't know, in that moment, whether she had done it on purpose, or whether the wine and the pressure and the particular exhaustion of performing a relationship in front of people who loved her had simply made the true story easier to access than the invented one. What he did know, with a certainty that arrived all at once, the way certain truths do, late and complete and impossible to take back, was that he could no longer tell where the performance had ended. The evening continued for another hour after that, conversation drifting towards safer ground, Elena eventually satisfied enough to stop interrogating and start simply enjoying the company, Priya distracted by a phone call from her own boyfriend, Rosa refilling everyone's wine with the generous insistence of a woman determined to keep a good night going. Daniel sat through all of it with Mara's hand occasionally finding his under the table, sometimes briefly, sometimes lingering longer than the performance required, and he found himself unable to tell which touches were for her mother's benefit and which ones simply were, because she wanted them to be, because something in the room had shifted and neither of them had yet found the language to name it out loud. It was nearly midnight when the apartment finally emptied. Elena hugged him at the door with unexpected warmth, told him to take care of her daughter, and informed him with the absolute confidence of a woman accustomed to being right that she expected to see him at Sunday dinner from now on. Priya hugged him too, quieter this time, and murmured, just for him, "You're a worse liar than you think you are, by the way," before following her mother out into the hallway, leaving him no time to ask what exactly she meant. Rosa kissed his cheek and told him, with the specific solemnity reserved for blessings, that he had her niece's whole heart and ought to know it. He did not have time to process that sentence before the door closed behind her. And then it was just the two of them, standing in an apartment that still smelled like lavender, in the sudden, enormous silence that follows a performance once the audience has gone home. Mara leaned back against the closed door and exhaled like she'd been holding the entire evening in her chest since the moment he arrived.
I am so sorry, she said.
I am so sorry I asked you to do that. I didn't think it would. I didn't expect Priya to, Mara. I don't even know what I said back there. I think I might have had more wine than I realized, and I just started talking, and I don't actually know what came out of my mouth, and I need you to tell me honestly if I made things unbearably weird, because I genuinely cannot tell from in here. Mara.
She stopped.
Looked at him properly for the first time since the door had closed, the performance gone now. Nothing left in the room to perform for. Was it true? He asked. Her face did something complicated. Fear and relief arriving at the same time, the way they sometimes do when a person has been caught in the act of telling the truth by accident. Which part? She said, though her voice suggested she already knew which part he meant. The part about almost losing me. The part about realizing you weren't fine with just being my friend. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence had lasted between them in 11 years. Daniel understood, watching her face in that silence, that whatever she said next would either confirm something he had wanted to be true since he was 23 years old, or it would quietly, gently, devastatingly end the only version of closeness he had ever let himself believe was safe to want. Yes, Mara said finally, so quietly he almost missed it. It was true. All of it. I just didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I'd been lying to you for years about being okay with how things were. You weren't the only one lying about that, Daniel said. Her eyes found his, and something in them changed. Understanding arriving slowly, the way it does when a person realizes a feeling they believed was entirely theirs had, in fact, been shared and hidden and carried separately by two people for far longer than either of them had admitted. How long? She said. 8 years, Daniel said. Give or take. 8 years, she repeated, like she needed to hear the number out loud to believe it. You've loved me for 8 years, and you let me ask you to pretend to be my boyfriend for one night instead of ever telling me? I was protecting something, Daniel said. I'd convinced myself that having you as a friend was safer than risking losing you completely as anything.
I think I was wrong about that.
I think I've probably been wrong about that for a long time, but it's a hard thing to admit when the alternative looks exactly like what almost happened tonight. Standing in a room full of people who love you, watching you almost tell them the truth by accident, and realizing I had no idea what I would have done if you hadn't. Mara crossed the small distance between them, not dramatically, not with any flourish, just 3 quiet steps that closed 11 years of careful distance in under 4 seconds. I'm done pretending, she said. I'm so tired of pretending. Tonight was supposed to be one night of it, and instead it turned into the realest conversation we've ever had, and I don't want to go back to before this. I don't think I can. Then don't, Daniel said. She kissed him before he finished the second word of whatever he had been about to say next, and whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore, because the truth had already arrived in the room and didn't need any more words to make itself completely understood. It was 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon that smelled like Elena's posel and the specific chaos of a Quinn family dinner in full swing, that Priya leaned across the table toward Daniel with the same investigative gleam she'd worn the night everything changed.
So, she said,
now that you two are actually together, and don't think I haven't noticed you're significantly worse at hiding it than you think, I have to ask. Did you two ever actually figure out what you're going to tell people going forward? Because the official story is still that you've been dating for 4 months, and that math is starting to get complicated. Daniel looked at Mara across the table. She looked back at him with the particular warmth of a person who had spent 11 years loving someone quietly and was no longer required to. We tell them the truth, Mara said. All of it. 11 years. 8 of them spent being 2 idiots, too careful to say anything, and one night where a fake relationship turned out to be the only real conversation either of us had been brave enough to have. That's a terrible answer for a dinner party, Priya said. It's a great answer, Elena corrected, refilling Daniel's bowl without being asked, the way she had started doing every Sunday since that first night. It's the only one that's actually true.
And it was.
Every part of it. The library, the 8 quiet years, the one performance that had stopped being a performance somewhere in the middle of an answer neither of them had planned to give honestly. The truth had been sitting underneath the lie the entire time, patient and unspoken, waiting for exactly the right room, exactly the right pressure, exactly the right person to ask the wrong question at exactly the right moment. Some doors only open because someone, eventually, finally, has the courage to knock on the wrong one first. If this story made you think of someone you've spent years being careful around, someone you've loved quietly, safely, from exactly the distance you convinced yourself was enough, tell us about them in the comments. Just a few words. Sometimes the bravest thing a person ever does is finally stop pretending.